Welcome back to Everyday Economics, the podcast that helps you learn about the economic world happening around you every day. I'm your host, Chris Krug, CEO of the 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan Franklin News Foundation. Everyday Economics, production of America's Talking Network, and you can subscribe to all of our podcasts at americastalking.com. To support Everyday Economics, please make a tax-deductible charitable contribution by clicking the link in the show description. We're recording this episode on Friday, July 26th, and joining me as always, Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist. Hey, Dr. O, you and I try to trade interesting stories in the news that we see to each other. You sent one my way that was kind of interesting. Not to say the others that you send me aren't interesting. The vast majority of the stuff you sent my way, I find it fascinating in most cases. But this story from the New York Times over the past couple of days, talking about the differences in upward mobility by demographics. And this is based on a study in which I believe that the study participants were born between 1980 and
1978 and 1992.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's like some stark contrast in there, in particular among poorer white people and poorer black people. And what is the study saying? And then what's your take on it?
Basically, the earnings of those children that came from high income families increased, while the earnings of children from low income families decreased. And so you got kind of a class gap that increased, right? But then the earnings for black children of all parental income levels actually increased, right? Closing the gap by about 30%. Now, so you got a race gap that shrank and you got a class gap that grew.
Interesting.
And part of the story is that while the earnings of black children increased, children of all parental incomes, families of all parental incomes increased, it was not necessarily true for white children. And the study basically shows that it had everything to do with employment rates. In places where you had kids were surrounded by adults that worked, those kids did better. And so when you consider a little bit the fact that a lot of the jobs that, I think of Detroit and some parts of the Pennsylvania that basically were affected by job loss and maybe some industries shifting, going overseas, it does make sense that people that lived in those areas may not have seen the kind of mobility that others have seen, specifically, especially those who lived on the coast of the United States, for example, closer to these big job centers, with the rise of the internet, but also the tech industry, et cetera, et cetera.
So, I mean, is there anything to the geography of this? Is this study capturing in any way the investment in large metropolitan areas versus the disinvestment in small town America, where manufacturing used to occur? I think about, I live in the state of Illinois. I think about downstate Illinois. It's rural, yes, of course, and it's extremely tilted in terms of demographics, largely very white. The economic prospects, in towns like, Metropolis and Cairo, Illinois, places like that. Is this like a sort of an articulation of American manufacturing just kind of going away in small town America?
Well, I think so. So first, I think most economists would agree that there's a clear link between your outcomes and your parents' outcomes. And so if your parents are doing well, you're likely to do better than someone whose parents aren't doing so well. You talk about disinvestment, and ultimately, right, when you think about investment, you think of both public and private investment. And that investor has to yield some sort of return. Otherwise, nobody will actually go ahead and invest there. I think it speaks to the fact that, we've promised the return of those jobs to American people who live in those areas forever.
Yes.
And the reality is it's unlikely that those jobs are ever coming back. And so we have to stop making false promises. And I say I'm really talking about the federal government. Now we're talking about making chips in the United States. And let's be honest, making chips in the United States will cost too much. making chips in the United States will make things less affordable, right? Today, we're walking around with these phones that are computers in our pockets because we're able to make chips a lot cheaper in places like Taiwan. And so, I mean, and this is kind of what I'm hearing. You know, you talk to people who actually invest money and for others, and they say, look, let's just be honest. You know, ideas like, hey, Taiwan should pay for its own defense, blah, 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 when essentially we are the ones benefiting a great deal from chips being manufactured in Taiwan, doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you're trying to increase mobility, if you're trying to get people access to decent retirements, et cetera, right? What we need to be doing is to stimulate economic growth, hopefully create an environment where inflation is low and stable, but also an economy that benefits everyone. And if we're not going to do that by engaging in trade wars and putting tariffs and all of those things and regulating the economy, we're likely to achieve that by creating an economy that is slightly less regulated, that allows builders to build housing at an that's more affordable to most Americans. You know, I mean, you talk about these markets, by the way, some of these markets, I think of some markets in Pennsylvania, and they're markets where you're seeing the fastest rent growth today. They don't build a ton of housing. Rents have slowed to 3.5% on a year-over-year basis. You look at some of these markets, rents are still growing at 7-8% year-over-year.
Yeah.
We need to build more housing. You know, housing makes up more than 30% of most people's incomes. And so if you're trying to create an environment where people are able to pick themselves up, well, they need jobs, but they also need affordable housing. And so anyway, I'm going to stay out of the policy conversation, but all I'm trying to say here is that we need to focus on things like creating more affordable housing across the country, as opposed to engaging in trade wars that will just make things more expensive and more difficult for everyday people.
Well, I want to come back and talk to you about the economics of small town America at some point. I think that would be just a valuable conversation for us to have. I appreciate your thoughts as always. For Dr. Orphe Divounguy, this has been Chris Krug. Subscribe to Everyday Economics and others at americastalking.com.